But what happened to a car if you run it for 30 miles without any transmission fluid? It's a good question, right? I wanted to tell you guys a story about my 2005 Honda Civic Hybrid that I bought. It had 66,000 miles on it in 2019, which I think is phenomenal. It must have been garaged up in Connecticut. It had Connecticut plates on when I bought it. And there's no rust other than the exhaust. So it obviously was in a bit of a humid, salty environment, but none of the body panels or anything are rusty, which is phenomenal. Had old, worn-out tires on it. Paid $1,500 for it. There was a hybrid warning light. I figured it was going to be the battery, the hybrid battery, that was bad. Turns out it was the commutation sensors. So this hybrid engine has commutation sensors that read where the flywheel is when it's revolving for the engine. And apparently this has to work in order for the hybrid motor to know where to apply power to start the car. So with that in mind, the car had to start on the 12-volt starter. The 12-volt battery only gets charged if, in the case that the hybrid system is disabled, which is in this case, the hybrid motor will charge the 12-volt battery if the RPMs are between 1,500 and 3,000. So if you're idling, you're not charging your battery, you get a battery warning light on your dashboard, your battery gets depleted. Then things are really bad, because then when you get to low RPM, you've got no power, so your electric steering and your dashboard and your spark plugs go out. It just makes it a mess. So this car seemed like a really bad mess when you go to get in it, just like any hybrid when you start losing electric parts, right? Anyway, threw a new 12-volt battery on there from Walmart and made it home just fine. I didn't know immediately that it was the commutation sensors, but I did some testing within the car, not wanting to drop the transmission. I ended up dropping the transmission, bought a used engine from a junkyard for $400 instead of paying $300 for commutation sensors, figuring I might need some other parts too, and that comes in handy, another part of the story here. But yeah, I dropped those commutation sensors in, put the transmission back in, put the car all back together. It ran beautifully. I was like, I did it. So for $1,900, I had this Honda Civic Hybrid with 66,000 miles on it. Interior's perfect. I mean, the rear bumper's been bumped, but the paint's not peeling. It's not like a Texas car that's been sitting out in the sun. I think this thing's been garaged, which is really nice. Certainly not cream puff, but for a 14-year-old Honda Civic, it's really great condition. Put some new tires on it, and was driving it back and forth to work. Made it 400 miles, 500 miles. I don't even know. I may have just filled up my first tank of fuel after having topped it off originally. And on the way home from work, I'm in traffic, stop and go, and the engine just dies. I get all my IMA lights on the dashboard, check engine light, lights up like a Christmas tree. And I'm like, okay, great. So I was able to restart. It restarted on the 12-volt starter. I had to keep the throttle feathered in order to keep it running. And I managed to make it home. Making home, I got smoke pouring out from under the hood. I'm like, oh no, please don't catch on fire. I open the hood, I'm looking down there. It's coming from the IMA motor, from that hybrid motor, between the engine and the transmission. I'm like, oh, great. So here we go. I pulled it back into the garage and dropped the transmission for a second time. And during this, I'm like, I should probably replace the clutch. This is the second time I've been in here. I didn't do it the first time. I just did the commutation sensors. Clutch didn't look that bad. But as I'm in there, I realized that the coils on the hybrid motor have burnt up. I think it was the all three phases, right? I think it's a three-phase motor, and there's three coils that are bad, and they're all next to each other. So I think it was the first or the last coil that shorted out. And that explains why I was having to feather the throttle, because if they're shorted out, that means that it's as if it's pulling that, 10 kilowatts or 13 kilowatts worth of energy from your ICE, your internal combustion engine, and just dumping it to ground. So it's like, oh my gosh. I made it to the driveway where my replacement motor's sitting. So sure enough, it's, of course I've got the hybrid motor already attached to that, and hey, yay, I only paid $100 for the hybrid piece because I already bought it for the commutation sensors and used those. So swapped out the hybrid bits from the junkyard motor onto my motor, put everything back together. But at that point, the clutch wasn't working right. There's very little travel in the clutch. When you let it out, it was slipping a little bit when you go, and then when you push the clutch all the way in, it doesn't fully disengage. It's like, okay, here we go. I didn't replace the clutch. I should have replaced the clutch. So I pulled the transmission out again. And this is where I learned my lessons, right? So I bought a clutch kit, pulled the transmission out. I cleaned everything up. It was the release bearing wasn't sliding on the transmission shaft very well. And so the clutch fork couldn't get that release bearing to push against the fingers of the clutch plate. So I was like, okay. So I cleaned it all up and put the new clutch kit in. Wasn't that big of a deal. Hey, I got better at it after the third time. I can drop a transmission in a Civic pretty quick. Put it all back together, and I've been driving for probably about 5,000 miles on this car now, and it runs great. But before I drove 5,000 miles on it, I made it to work the first time, and I was sitting there, and I realized that I did not put transmission fluid back in after the third time that I dropped it. And I'm at work. And to put transmission fluid in, you got to have the stupid little hose or something to squirt the transmission fluid in, because you got to get through the wheel well into there or from the top, and yeah, it's just a pain. I'm like, I don't know if I want to bother doing that. It was heat of summer. I didn't want to be out in the full sun trying to put transmission fluid in my car in the parking lot at work. I was like, I'll try and get home. It didn't act weird on the way here. Maybe it'll just make it home. I'll be okay. I'll be easy on the transmission. I'll drive slow. I won't use the synchro as much. I'll rev match. Made it about 5 miles down the road, and it starts popping out of gear. Tried a different gear. It would pop out of that gear. Tried going slower. It would pop out. So I'm like, okay. So I pulled over. I'm hoping that I didn't damage my transmission permanently. The wife came and saved me. We went and got the tube and the funnel, and we put transmission fluid in it, and it ran fine. We got all the way home. Didn't pop out of gear. And as I said, I've driven it for another 5,000 miles. This thing has 70,000 miles on it now. It's a little cream puff for mechanically at this point. And runs great. Doesn't pop out of gear. So there you go. There is a possibility that if you accidentally run your transmission with no oil at all, not a drop, that put transmission fluid back in it and it'll be okay. It amazes me how sturdy cars are nowadays. And I don't know, maybe a 60s car with no transmission fluid would do the same thing, but it just amazes me. You can drive a car for 30 miles with no oil whatsoever, and I realize it's a manual transmission, but you still got those synchros in there and whatnot, and it all still works fine.